There is a prison that almost no one notices. It has no bars, walls, or chains. It works in a much simpler way. You want something, you get it. You get used to it. And then you start wanting something else. More money, more recognition, more pleasure, more of something. And the more you chase after it, the farther the finish line seems to move. Philosophy has understood this cycle for centuries. And maybe understanding how it works is the first step toward escaping it. For Schopenhauer, the problem does not begin when you fail to get what you want. It begins earlier, in the very act of wanting. In the world as will and representation, he describes human beings as expressions of a constant force called the will, a blind drive with no final goal, and no point where it permanently says, enough. You may believe you only want a better job, more money, recognition, love, or security. But when you finally get one of those things, you notice something unsettling. The satisfaction lasts less than you expected. The desire changes shape, finds a new target, and starts all over again inside you. This is one of Schopenhauer's most uncomfortable ideas. Wanting is not simply choosing something and moving toward it. To desire something means to feel that something is missing. While you want it, you feel the distance between your current situation and the imagined situation that promises to make you feel complete. That is why desire comes with tension. You feel restless while the goal is still out of reach. You think that tension will disappear once you finally get what you are looking for. And it does for a while. But the mind does not stay at rest. Soon, a new need appears, a different comparison takes over, or an unexpected ambition begins to grow. Final satisfaction is simply pushed forward to the next desire. This is where one of the most famous images in his philosophy appears. Life swings like a pendulum between pain and boredom. Pain comes from wanting something you still do not have. Boredom appears when what once seemed so important no longer occupies your mind. Think about waiting for a promotion. For months, it may seem to represent respect, peace of mind, and progress. When you finally get it, you feel excited. Then the new position becomes normal. What seemed extraordinary yesterday becomes part of everyday life. The problem was not the promotion itself. The problem was expecting a limited achievement to create complete and lasting satisfaction. Schopenhauer wants to show that this pattern does not depend on what you want. The same process can appear in shopping, careers, relationships, social status, or the search for new experiences. The objects change, but the cycle stays the same. Lack, effort, achievement, relief, adjustment, and then another desire. That is why someone can have a lot and still feel hungry for more. Having more on the outside does not bring the will to an end. Sometimes it simply gives it more ways to express itself. The more possibilities you have, the more things may seem to be missing. The question changes from, what am I missing? To, why do I always need to want something? This also helps explain why so many achievements lose their excitement so quickly. Before we get something, our imagination increases its value. We place a promise on that thing that it may never have made. A relationship is supposed to remove all loneliness. Money is supposed to remove all insecurity. Recognition is supposed to remove every doubt about our worth. But no single thing can carry that much weight. When we finally get it, we meet the real thing, not the fantasy we created while waiting for it. And reality always has limits. For Schopenhauer, suffering comes from this endless wanting that demands an answer from the world that the world can never make permanent. But it would be a mistake to turn Schopenhauer into someone who simply tells us to give up every desire. His argument is much more radical than that. For him, the will is not just a conscious list of personal goals. It is the drive that appears in the body, survival, sexuality, competition, and the basic struggle to keep living. You do not solve the problem just by removing one desire from your list, because wanting will find another way out. It is like closing one door while several others remain open. The issue is not finding the perfect desire. The issue is realizing that the very structure of wanting makes permanent satisfaction impossible. Even so, Schopenhauer points to moments when the control of desire becomes weaker. One of those moments happens through art. When we look at a work of art, a landscape, or listen deeply to music, we may stop looking at everything in terms of our own interests. Instead of asking, "What do I get from this?" we simply experience it. That moment matters because for a short time, our awareness stops serving desire. This is not happiness that was bought, achieved, or shown to other people. It is a temporary break from wanting. That is why art has such an important place in his philosophy. It gives us a brief experience of freedom from the constant pressure of the will. There is also an ethical side to this idea. If all of us are driven by desires, needs, and suffering, then pain no longer looks like a personal failure. Other people are also trapped in the same cycle of wanting, losing, fearing, and searching. This helps explain the importance Schopenhauer gives to compassion. Recognizing suffering can reduce our obsession with our own interests. Instead of seeing every person as a competitor, an obstacle, or a tool for satisfying our desires, we begin to see them as someone who is also vulnerable. Understanding desire, then, does not have to lead to cynicism. It can lead to a less selfish relationship with other people. Applied to everyday life, Schopenhauer's idea completely changes the way we understand satisfaction. Maybe you are not unhappy because you chose the wrong goals. Maybe you are expecting those goals to do something they simply cannot do. Buying something can bring pleasure. Getting promoted can improve your life. Finding someone can bring love. None of these things need to be rejected. The problem begins when every achievement is given the job of permanently ending the feeling that something is missing. At that point, you are no longer simply wanting something. You are asking it to save you. No limited achievement can fully answer an unlimited expectation without eventually disappointing you. The lesson is not that you should hate your desires, but that you should see them clearly. When a new thought appears saying, "If I get this, then I'll finally be satisfied," pay attention to that sentence before you follow it. How many times has the word "finally" already appeared in your life? How many achievements that once looked like final destinations quickly became part of the background? Schopenhauer forces us to separate temporary satisfaction from permanent freedom. The first is real. The second does not simply come from the next achievement. Understanding this changes your relationship with desire. You can still want things, build things, and make choices, but you stop treating every desire as an absolute promise of happiness. Epicurus begins with a simple suspicion. Maybe your restlessness does not come from lacking things, but from having too many desires that you have learned to see as necessary. In his letter to Menicius, he argues that understanding our desires is essential for living well. The problem is not simply wanting whatever appears in front of us, but failing to separate real needs from impulses created by comparison, fear, or vanity. When that distinction disappears, life turns into an endless race after things that promise peace, but often create new forms of dependence inside us every day. For Epicurus, desires can be divided into three groups. Some are natural and necessary, such as food, shelter, friendship, and basic security. Others are natural but not necessary, such as fancy food or more refined pleasures. Then there are empty desires, connected to fame, power, status, and unlimited wealth. This classification is not meant to condemn pleasure. It is meant to stop us from confusing luxury with necessity. The more things you see as essential, the more vulnerable you become. If your peace of mind depends on 100 outside conditions, any change can feel like a serious threat to the balance of your everyday life. That is why Epicurus places so much value on self-sufficiency or autarkia. It does not mean isolation, forced poverty, or rejecting everything pleasant. It means learning to need less in order to remain calm. Someone who can only enjoy life when surrounded by abundance makes their own well-being fragile. Someone who can also enjoy simple things becomes more free. In the letter to Menicius, Epicurus explains that getting used to a simple life prepares us not to fear changes in fortune. The point is not to reject comfort, but to avoid turning comfort into a requirement for feeling genuine satisfaction in any situation. This idea strongly goes against a culture that turns preferences into needs. You like something, then you get used to it, and soon you begin to feel that you cannot live without it. The desire quietly moves into a different category. An optional pleasure starts being treated like a basic right. When that happens, losing it feels like suffering, even though it was never truly essential. Epicurus invites us to examine this change. What in your daily life is actually necessary for living well, and what only feels necessary because you have repeated it enough times to mistake habit for need? Epicurean pleasure is also often misunderstood. Epicurus does not recommend a life of constant excess. In fact, he describes the most stable form of pleasure as freedom from mental disturbance and freedom from unnecessary physical pain. The word ataraxia describes this inner calm. This completely changes the question of satisfaction. Instead of asking, "How can I feel more?" you begin asking, "What can I stop demanding?" Sometimes peace does not come from adding another pleasure, but from removing a demand that kept the mind constantly tense and too dependent on outside approval. Think about the desire for recognition. Receiving praise can feel good, but turning approval into a need creates a deeper problem. Other people's opinions are unstable, selective, and impossible to fully control. If you depend on them to confirm your worth, you never know when you have received enough. One compliment brings relief today, but tomorrow you will need another one. Epicurus would be suspicious of this kind of desire because it has no clear natural limit. Hunger ends when the body has enough food. Thirst ends when we drink. Status, however, can keep demanding more even after years of public success. Wealth is another important example. Epicurus does not say that money is bad by itself. Material resources can reduce real suffering by providing food, shelter, and some security. The danger begins when wealth stops serving life and life starts serving wealth. At that point, the number no longer has a reasonable limit. You stop asking how much you need and start asking how much more you could collect. Comparing yourself with richer people keeps an artificial feeling of not having enough alive. Even when you already have what you need, you can still feel poor because you measure your life through competition instead of real necessity. This is also why friendship has such an important place in Epicurean philosophy. Unlike possessions that depend on display, friendship offers emotional security, conversation, trust, and companionship. Epicurus even organized his school, known as the Garden, as a community where human relationships were part of the philosophical life. This reveals something important. Living well does not require constantly increasing stimulation. It requires building stable conditions for peace of mind. A simple meal with friends can bring more satisfaction than an expensive feast meant to impress strangers. The first meets deep human needs. The second may feed the endless desire for approval. This philosophy requires a kind of education of desire. Epicurus does not ask you to destroy every personal wish, but to learn how to examine where it comes from, what it costs, and whether it has a limit. Before chasing something, ask what will happen if you get it, and what will happen if you do not. Will the desire create freedom or dependence? Will it meet a real need or create another obligation? Some desires have a psychological cost greater than the pleasure they promise. Some ambitions demand so much anxiety, comparison, and constant attention that a person loses peace of mind before even reaching the thing they hoped would make them happy. Perhaps Epicurus's most relevant message today is this: not every desire deserves to be followed just because it feels strong. Some desires need to be fulfilled. Others need to be examined. When you learn to recognize the difference, satisfaction no longer depends on endlessly increasing your achievements. Life can still include pleasure, comfort, and ambition without turning every preference into an emergency. The Epicurean question is simple but demanding. How many things that seem essential to you today would truly be necessary for a peaceful, dignified, and enjoyable life? Maybe needing fewer things is a deeper form of abundance than owning more things. There is something unsettling about finally getting what you wanted. Almost immediately, what once seemed solid begins to change. The new job becomes ordinary, the relationship changes, the body changes, the house wears down, and the praise fades from memory. Buddhism calls this condition impermanence, anicca. Everything that arises depends on conditions, and because it depends on them, it cannot remain the same forever. The teaching associated with the Buddha does not simply say that things end. It says something more personal. When we try to turn temporary experiences into permanent guarantees, we create a tension that no achievement can completely solve forever. In the Dhammapada, we find the idea that all conditioned things are impermanent. This is not a pessimistic statement about the weakness of the world, but a description of how reality works. A flower blooms because certain conditions come together. Later, other conditions appear and it fades. The same happens with feelings, social positions, emotional states, and identities. Nothing has to be broken in order to change. Change is not an accident within life. It is part of life itself. We suffer more when we treat inevitable change as if it were a personal violation of the order we expected to keep forever for our own comfort. This becomes clearer when you look at a moment of intense happiness. Imagine receiving news you have waited years to hear. In the first few minutes, your body reacts, your mind lights up, and it seems impossible that the feeling could ever lose its strength. But it does. Not because you are ungrateful, but because mental states are also conditioned. The brain adjusts, new worries appear, and other experiences take up space. Buddhism does not treat this fading as a moral failure. It asks you to see things clearly. Pleasure is pleasure, but it is not permanent. Confusing the two turns a beautiful experience into a demand against time. The difficulty becomes greater when attachment appears, often connected to the term upadana. Attachment does not simply mean liking something. It means holding on to it as if its stability could guarantee our own stability. You do not just love someone. You begin to demand that the relationship never change. You do not just appreciate youth. You want the body to remain the same. You do not just gain respect. You need people to keep seeing you in the same way. In this process, pleasure is given an impossible task, protecting you from change. The more valuable the experience becomes, the greater the fear of losing it can be when we forget that it is temporary by nature. This is where impermanence connects with dukkha, a word often translated as suffering, dissatisfaction, or a deeper sense of uneasiness. The problem is not that every pleasant experience is painful. The problem is trying to get absolute security from something that is always changing. It is like placing all your weight on a chair that is constantly transforming. While it supports you, there is relief. When it changes, resistance appears. According to the first noble truth, conditioned existence involves dukkha. Understanding this does not require rejecting life. It means letting go of expectations that do not fit the changing and unstable nature of human experience. That is why Buddhist mindfulness practice is not only meant for relaxation. It trains you to notice change while it is happening. In your breathing, you notice the beginning, duration, and end of each cycle. In your emotions, you see that anger, excitement, fear, and desire appear, remain for a while, and then disappear or change. This observation weakens a powerful illusion. the feeling that this will be like this forever. When you directly see that everything is part of a process, you stop confusing intensity with permanence and learn to move through experiences without demanding that they freeze into one final and unchanging form. There is also a surprising consequence. Impermanence does not only threaten the things we love, it also makes it possible for pain to pass. If nothing ever changed, a loss would last forever. A humiliation would never lose its power, and one mistake would define you permanently. The same law that causes pleasures to fade also causes suffering to fade. This balance is important because it prevents us from reading the teaching in a completely negative way. Seneca does not say, "You will lose everything, so do not love." It shows that loving requires recognizing change. We can care deeply without demanding permanent possession, allowing gratitude to replace some of the anxiety created by the impossible need to hold on forever. Now consider identity. Often, we do not only want to preserve our possessions, but also a specific version of who we are. I am successful. I am admired. I am strong. When circumstances change, we do not just lose something external. We may feel that part of ourselves has been taken away. Buddhism takes this analysis further by connecting impermanence with anatta, the absence of a permanent and independent self. What we call the self is also made up of changing processes. Resistance grows when we try to turn a temporary picture of our personality into a fixed identity that time and circumstances are never allowed to change. This changes the way we experience achievement. Instead of receiving it with the silent demand that it must last, we can receive it as something happening in the present. There is a deep difference between saying, "This needs to continue for me to be okay," and saying, "This is here now, so I can fully appreciate it." The first statement turns pleasure into a contract with the future. The second recognizes that it is temporary without reducing its value. In fact, knowing that something will pass can make us pay more attention to it, because we stop delaying our presence under the illusion that it will always be available tomorrow in exactly the same form. Perhaps this is why the teaching of impermanence can change even the way we hold what we love. A closed hand tries to keep something forever. An open hand can touch without trapping it. The Buddha does not offer a method for stopping people, stages of life, emotions, or achievements from disappearing. He changes the task. Learn to be present with them without demanding protection from time. As this understanding grows, every change stops feeling like a betrayal by reality. The present moment becomes valuable precisely because it cannot be stored forever. And maybe peace begins when you stop asking permanence from things that were born to change. Plato does not begin by asking how many things you desire, but who inside you is governing those desires. In the Republic, he compares the human soul to a city that needs order. In this inner city, there are different forces. Reason, which is responsible for judgment, the spirited part, connected to courage and anger, and the appetites, which are focused on food, sex, money, comfort, and physical pleasure. The problem is not having appetites. The problem begins when they take control. Without reason setting limits, every desire quickly learns to ask for more than it truly needs in order to feel satisfied. For Plato, justice in the soul depends on the right hierarchy. Reason should govern because it is the part that can look at life as a whole, consider consequences, and choose what is truly good. Appetites, on the other hand, only see what they want in the moment. Hunger wants food. Thirst wants something to drink. Greed wants more possessions. None of these impulses by themselves ask whether today's satisfaction might destroy something more important tomorrow. When appetite makes the decision alone, it turns intensity into authority. The stronger the impulse feels, the more it demands to be obeyed, even when that demand goes against what is good for the person. This dynamic appears dramatically in Plato's description of the tyrannical man. In the Republic, Plato shows that political tyranny has a psychological equivalent. The inner tyrant is the person who has lost the ability to bring order to his own desires. One dominant appetite begins pushing aside limits, shame, caution, and relationships. What once seemed forbidden starts to feel necessary. What once seemed enough begins to feel like too little. The person believes he is exercising freedom because he does whatever he wants, but Plato turns this idea upside down. Someone who cannot say no to his own impulses is not free. He is ruled by them from within. This point matters because satisfying a desire does not always make it disappear. Some desires become stronger through repetition. When every impulse gets an immediate response, the soul learns that any discomfort must be removed right away. Small frustrations then become harder to tolerate. The person can no longer stand waiting, giving something up, or choosing between different goals. He wants pleasure without cost, recognition without criticism, wealth without limits, and power without resistance. Plato understands that a lack of discipline does not create inner abundance. It creates dependence. An appetite that never meets a boundary stops being one part of life and begins reorganizing the whole of life around itself. That is why Plato connects moral education with training our desires. Education does not mean crushing the body or declaring war on pleasure. It means teaching each part of the soul to stay in its proper place. Reason must learn to recognize what is good. The spirited part should support what reason sees as just, and the appetites must accept limits. When this harmony exists, a person does not need to eliminate every pleasure in order to have self-control. He can enjoy pleasure without allowing it to become his master. Moderation, or sophrosyne, appears as an agreement about which part should govern a person's life as a whole. This view also explains why Plato is suspicious of a society that celebrates every desire simply because it is an individual choice. In Book 8 of the Republic, while discussing democracy and its possible decline, he describes a kind of person who treats every appetite as equally important. Today, he wants discipline. Tomorrow, he gives it up for entertainment. Later, he wants wealth. Then he wants status. There is no higher principle organizing these choices. There is only a constant sequence of changing desires. For Plato, this appearance of freedom can hide disorder, because living according to whatever impulse appears means allowing chance to keep deciding what kind of person you become. Think about how this can work in modern consumer life. You buy something because you believe it will finally remove a certain feeling of dissatisfaction. Soon after, another product appears and seems like an essential upgrade. The cycle does not continue only because the market keeps offering new things, but also because an appetite trained to always want something new loses the ability to recognize when enough is enough. Plato would say that the problem is not simply the number of things available. It is the lack of inner government. When nothing inside you has the authority to say, enough, the world can become a catalog of temptations. The more choices appear, the harder it becomes to tell the difference between a conscious decision and simply giving in to an impulse. But being governed by reason does not mean coldly calculating every pleasure. For Plato, reason is connected to knowledge of what is good, not just to efficiency. A desire can be pursued very efficiently and still lead you in the wrong direction. Someone may perfectly plan how to gain status, manipulate people, or build wealth while remaining deeply disordered inside. Practical intelligence is not the same as wisdom. Plato's question would be different. Does what you desire make your soul more just, balanced, and capable of recognizing what is good? Or does it simply make one particular appetite better at getting what it wants? Not every success proves that the right part of the soul is in control. The famous story of the Ring of Gyges, told in the Republic, takes this question even further. Gyges finds a ring that allows him to become invisible, and once he is protected from social consequences, he begins satisfying ambitions that would previously have been held back. The story asks whether someone would remain just if he had the power to do anything without being caught. For our topic, the point is clear. Outside limits may control behavior, but they do not necessarily bring order to desire. If you are only moderate when punishment is possible, you still do not fully govern yourself. The real test appears when you could cross the line freely and still recognize good reasons not to do it. Plato's lesson, then, is not that life should become a list of restrictions. It is that freedom requires inner structure. A healthy appetite can say, "I want this." A well-governed soul can also ask, "Should I?" That small space between impulse and decision prevents individual desires from taking over the entire throne. When reason loses this role, every temporary desire begins claiming absolute urgency, and a person starts serving his own appetites while believing he is serving himself. Plato leaves us with a demanding image. Real disorder begins when the loudest citizen in the inner city is given the crown simply because he shouts louder than everyone else. Seneca notices a deeply familiar human weakness. We receive something, get used to it, and soon begin treating it as if it had always been there. In his letters to Lucilius, he returns again and again to the idea that poverty is not only about having too little, but also about constantly wanting more. A person can be surrounded by resources and still live with a feeling of scarcity. When the mind loses the ability to recognize what is enough, any amount of abundance becomes insufficient, because desire grows faster than anything we can accumulate over the course of an entire life. This Stoic criticism does not mean celebrating poverty or pretending that material needs do not matter. Seneca understood the difference between comfort, security, and real deprivation. His concern was something else. When we turn external possessions into the main measure of a good life, we hand our peace of mind over to fortune. What exists today may disappear tomorrow. What feels abundant today may seem ordinary after comparison. That is why recognizing what is enough is not the same as giving up. It means learning to separate what truly improves life from what only feeds a growing need to have more in order to keep feeling valuable, secure, respected, or approved by others. In On the Shortness of Life, Seneca argues that we are not given a short life. Often, we make it short by the way we waste it. This idea also applies to dissatisfaction. We can spend years chasing some future condition that, once achieved, immediately becomes just another step toward something else. Life begins to be measured, not by what has been lived, but by what is still missing. At that pace, the present never receives enough attention to reveal its value. A person stays too busy preparing for the next improvement to notice what has already been achieved through years of effort. This is where comparison becomes dangerous. You may feel satisfied with your home until you visit a larger one. You may consider your job good until you find out how much someone else earns. You may feel comfortable with your appearance until you begin comparing yourself every day with idealized images. Seneca would understand this as dependence on outside standards. Comparison moves the center of judgment. You stop asking whether you have what you need and begin asking whether you have as much as someone else. Since there will always be someone with more, the idea of enough disappears and is replaced by a race with no real finish line. In the letters to Lucilius, we find an idea often connected with Stoic thought. The person who has little is not poor, but the person who always wants more is. The idea is challenging because it changes the meaning of wealth. If wealth only means quantity, there will never be a safe point of arrival because we can always imagine a larger number. But if wealth also means freedom from the constant need to accumulate, then someone with less may be inwardly freer than someone surrounded by excess. The question is no longer simply how much you have, but how much you need in order not to feel inferior to the rest of the world. Seneca also recommends voluntary exercises in simplicity. In one of his letters, he suggests spending a few days with simple food and modest living conditions, while asking yourself whether this was really what you feared so much. The exercise is not meant to glorify suffering. It trains psychological independence. When you discover that you can live with less than you imagined, certain fears lose some of their power. Luxury can still be enjoyable, but it no longer functions as an absolute necessity. That difference can deeply change your relationship with money, comfort, and fear, because you begin to see that part of your insecurity came from inflated expectations, not only from real dangers. There is, however, an even more important emotional layer. Recognizing what is enough requires learning to notice again what has become ordinary. Health often seems unremarkable until you become sick. Time with someone you love can feel guaranteed until a goodbye comes. Freedom can seem invisible until it is restricted. Stoicism uses the thought of loss not to create anxiety, but to restore awareness. When we imagine that something might no longer be available, its value is no longer hidden by habit. Gratitude, in this sense, is not naive. It is a disciplined way of paying attention to what familiarity often makes invisible in everyday life. This does not mean repeating positive phrases while real problems remain unsolved. Seneca does not recommend self-deception. He recommends perspective. A setback should be seen for what it really is, not made larger through comparison, imagination, and fear. In the same way, something good that is already present deserves to be noticed before the mind turns it into something ordinary and expected. Many people strongly notice what they have lost, but barely notice what they still have. The Stoic exercise is to correct this imbalance of attention, to recognize what is present without denying what still needs to be faced with courage, good judgment, and responsibility. There is also an irony. Someone who never recognizes what is enough may eventually lose the ability to enjoy what they worked so hard to gain. The achievement arrives, but attention has already moved ahead. The body is sitting at the table while the mind is planning the next victory. Wealth grows while the feeling of security stays the same. Recognition increases while the fear of losing relevance grows with it. Seneca shows us that accumulating without recognizing creates a kind of poverty of perception. There may be plenty around you, but almost nothing is experienced as truly enough. Material abundance and inner scarcity can exist in the same person at the same time. Seneca's teaching, then, requires a change in how we measure life. Instead of judging life only by the next thing you can add, try noticing what already supports your days: relationships, time, abilities, shelter, knowledge, opportunities, and choices that may have become ordinary to you. This does not eliminate ambition or prevent growth. It only prevents growth from being confused with salvation. For the Stoic, someone who always depends on the next gain remains controlled by fortune. Someone who recognizes what is enough regains something much rarer: the ability to consciously enjoy what is already present before time turns that presence into a memory forever. Laozi offers a surprising reversal for anyone who has learned to measure life by what they can add to it. In the Tao Te Ching, he repeatedly suggests that excess can hide what truly matters. The more objects, commitments, stimulation, goals, and worries we collect, the harder it can become to notice what is already in front of us. The problem is not simply having too much, but allowing quantity to take over all of our attention. When the mind becomes used to excess, simple things begin to feel empty, even though they may be exactly where we find room to breathe, observe, and live with greater inner clarity. This idea appears in the way Laozi talks about emptiness. In one of the best-known chapters of the Tao Te Ching, he reminds us that a bowl is useful because of the empty space inside it, and that doors and windows make a house livable because of the space they leave open. The image is powerful because it challenges our tendency to value only what can be counted, displayed, or stored. What we add is not always what makes life work. Often, It is the space we preserve. A completely full schedule may look productive, but it can also remove silence, reflection, and the ability to truly feel what is happening. The Tao Te Ching warns that the 5 colors blind the eyes, that too many sounds can overwhelm the ears, and too many flavors can dull the taste. The language is ancient, but the experience feels surprisingly modern. When everything has to be intense, new, or immediate, subtle things lose their power over us. A quiet moment feels like it is not enough. A simple meal feels boring. A conversation without excitement feels empty. The problem is not colors, sounds, or flavors themselves, but the overload that reduces our ability to notice small differences and simple pleasures in ordinary daily life. That is why Laozi does not present letting go as a punishment, but as a way to recover sensitivity. Having less does not mean rejecting everything pleasant. It means preventing pleasure from needing to grow constantly just to be noticed. If every pleasure has to be stronger than the one before it, you enter a cycle where intensity replaces presence. The same applies to status, consumption, and information. The more you receive, the faster you learn to treat as normal what once felt extraordinary. The Tao suggests a different rhythm. Notice before adding, empty before filling, and ask whether what is coming into your life truly expands it or simply takes up space. This helps explain the famous Taoist respect for simplicity. In the Tao Te Ching, Laozi connects contentment with the ability to recognize limits and avoid desires created by showing off and comparison. For him, a life built too heavily around acquiring things creates restlessness, because your identity begins to depend on what can be lost, compared, or surpassed. The more things you use to define who you are, the more threatening any loss becomes. Simplicity becomes a form of freedom, because it reduces the number of outside things needed to support a satisfying image of yourself in your own eyes and in the eyes of others. There is another central idea as well. Wu Wei, often translated as action without forced effort. It does not mean complete passivity, but acting in harmony with the natural flow of things without trying to control everything. Accumulation can come from the belief that everything must be guaranteed, predicted, and kept under control. More money, more contacts, more options, more plans, more protection. Each layer promises security, but each one also requires maintenance. Laozi would be suspicious of this constant increase, because what is supposed to make life easier can end up creating new responsibilities. Sometimes doing less allows you to respond better to what is happening right now. Water, a repeated image in the Tao Te Ching, helps explain this attitude. Water benefits things without competing with them, and moves toward low places that many people avoid. Its strength does not come from becoming rigid, but from adapting, flowing around obstacles, and continuing forward. This comparison reveals a criticism of a life based only on constant expansion. Always growing, always owning more, and always winning may look like strength, but they can also hide an inability to bend. Laozi suggests that flexibility can protect what excessive hardness often breaks when it meets the unavoidable resistance of an unpredictable life. Applied to everyday life, this changes some very practical questions. Instead of only asking what you can add, ask what you could remove without making your life poorer. Maybe there are commitments you keep only out of habit, things you buy only to follow trends, opinions you consume only because everyone is talking about them, or goals you chase because society makes them seem necessary. Each one takes up mental space. Together, they can create a life full of content, but poor in attention. Laozi forces us to consider whether filling every empty space is really a sign of richness, or simply a fear of facing what cannot easily be decorated, bought, or controlled. There is also an ethical effect that comes from reducing excess. When we constantly need to show more, achieve more, or own more, other people tend to become points of comparison. We stop noticing who they are and focus instead on what they have. Our view becomes narrow because relationships turn into ways of measuring status. Taoist simplicity interrupts part of this process by reducing the importance of display. When we feel less need to prove our value through outside signs, it becomes easier to notice presence, character, and mutual care. Less competition on the surface can create room for relationships that are less calculated, more human, and more genuinely attentive. Laozi leaves us, then, with a challenge that goes beyond simply owning less. The deeper question is what excess does to your ability to notice life. If it demands constant attention, it may steal the very ability to see what makes life worth living. Maybe wealth should not be measured only by how much has entered your hands, but also by how much inner space remains afterward. For the Tao, emptiness is not a failure to fill something. It is what makes use, movement, and openness possible. Someone who fills everything may eventually have no room left to receive what life brings unexpectedly. Marcus Aurelius understood that much of human anxiety comes from a quiet confusion. We treat things as our responsibility, even when they were never fully in our hands. In Meditations, he returns again and again to the need to separate what depends on our judgment, our intentions and our actions from what belongs to the course of events. When you try to control other people's opinions, the future, loss, chance, or the reactions of others, you turn uncertainty into a constant battle. Instead of meeting reality as it is, you keep questioning it for not following your plans. This does not mean Marcus Aurelius recommends passivity. As a Roman emperor, he dealt with wars, disease, political conflict, and real responsibilities. His stoicism was not about escaping the world, but about learning how to act within it without demanding impossible guarantees. You can prepare for a decision, study your options, speak carefully, and choose your attitude honestly. What you cannot do is completely determine how other people will respond or how events will end. Confusing influence with control creates frustration, because you begin demanding from yourself a kind of power that no human being truly has over the world around them. In Meditations, Marcus Aurelius reminds himself that outside events do not enter the mind with a ready-made meaning. We are the ones who add judgments to them. Criticism may be unpleasant, but deciding that it has destroyed your worth is an extra judgment. A delay may interfere with your plans, but saying the whole day has been ruined is another layer added by the mind. This distinction does not remove real difficulties. It keeps the mind from increasing suffering by turning setbacks into absolute judgments about life. Between what happens and how you respond, there is still a space where your freedom can act. The desire to control what cannot be controlled often hides behind the idea of responsible planning. You rehearse conversations that may never happen, try to predict every possible reaction, and mentally review situations you have no power to prevent. The intention may seem wise, but the result can be exhausting. Marcus Aurelius suggests another use of reason. Prepare without demanding certainty. The future should be dealt with when it becomes the present, using the resources available at that moment. Thinking ahead is useful when it leads to real action. It becomes torment when it only repeats possibilities without producing any useful response. Thinking more does not necessarily mean having more control over what has not happened yet. This attitude becomes especially important when dealing with other people. You can explain, advise, ask, negotiate, and set boundaries, but you cannot control another person's mind. Even so, much of our dissatisfaction comes from expecting others to think, feel, or act exactly the way we believe they should. Marcus Aurelius recommends remembering that each person acts according to what seems true or desirable to them at that moment. This does not excuse injustice or remove consequences. It simply weakens a dangerous illusion, the belief that your peace depends on changing everyone around you until they behave in the way you consider acceptable. There is also the issue of recognition. We can act with integrity, and still be misunderstood. We can work hard and receive no praise. We can tell the truth and still face rejection. For Marcus Aurelius, turning reputation into a need means handing control of your life over to opinions that are constantly changing. In Meditations, he reflects on how quickly both the remembered and the people who remember them disappear. Fame loses some of its power when viewed against the scale of time. This does not mean that other people's opinions are always irrelevant. It means they should not become the final judge of your character or your peace of mind. Another important area is loss. Everything we have depends on conditions we cannot fully control. Health, money, position, relationships, and even our own bodies. Marcus Aurelius repeatedly reflects on change as part of nature. Things appear, change, and eventually make room for something else. Emotionally resisting this movement does not stop it from happening. It only adds another layer of conflict to something that is already difficult. Stoic discipline means caring for what is present, without imagining that care gives us permanent ownership. Loving something does not require pretending that it will remain available for as long as we want. There is a famous idea in Meditations in which Marcus Aurelius advises us to receive without pride and let go without attachment. The idea captures a way of living with temporary possession. If something good comes into your life, you can use and appreciate it with gratitude. If it leaves, you do not have to treat its departure as the destruction of your ability to live well. This is difficult because the mind often confuses presence with a guarantee. After enough time, something temporary begins to feel permanent. Stoicism tries to correct that illusion before reality does it in a more painful way, reminding us that receiving something never meant gaining complete control over how long it would stay. Practicing this philosophy requires paying attention to the language inside your own mind. Notice how often you think something has to happen in a certain way. The meeting has to go well. The person has to respond. The project has to be recognized. The treatment has to produce the expected result. Some of these hopes are understandable, but the words "has to" turn a preference into a demand made against reality. Marcus Aurelius would replace that kind of rigidity with a more flexible attitude. I will do the best I can, as long as nothing outside my control prevents the result. Your intention can remain strong while the outcome stays open to reality and its unavoidable uncertainty. Perhaps the greatest relief Marcus Aurelius offers is the realization that accepting the limits of your control does not make you weaker. It directs your strength toward where it can actually work. You do not control tomorrow, but you can control the quality of the decision you make now. You do not control how someone will remember you, but you can choose to act justly. You do not control every loss, but you can choose the character with which you face change. Stoic peace comes from this redirection of energy, less effort trying to control the entire world, and more attention to the only authority truly available to you, the authority over your judgments, choices, and actions. In the Bhagavad Gita, Arjuna faces a problem that is not only military, moral, or religious. He is paralyzed by the need to know whether his actions will produce the right result. Standing on the battlefield, he hesitates because he imagines the consequences, fears loss, and tries to find a decision that can guarantee a future he can live with. Krishna redirects his attention. The teaching is not, do not care about what happens, but rather, do not make the result of your action the condition for acting correctly. Anxiety grows when you do something while already living mentally in a result that does not yet exist. This idea appears clearly in verse 2.47, one of the most quoted passages in the text. You have a right to action, but not to its fruits. The statement can sound strange, because almost everything in our culture is organized around results. We study to get a grade, work to earn money, train to win, and create to be recognized. The Gita does not deny these outcomes or say that goals are useless. It questions the interdependence that appears when the value of an action exists only if a certain result happens exactly as we expect and at the time we want. Attachment to the outcome can even change the quality of the action itself. When you desperately need to win, your attention is no longer fully focused on what you are doing. One part of your mind is wondering how people will react, another is afraid of failure, and another is comparing you with someone who achieved more. The present becomes nothing more than a hallway leading to a future reward. Paradoxically, this obsession can make you perform worse, because energy that should go into focus, preparation, and good judgment is consumed by worry about what might happen. Krishna teaches Arjuna to act with presence, discipline, and determination, while allowing the result to come from causes that no single person can completely control. This does not mean ignoring responsibility for the predictable consequences of your choices. That would be a shallow reading of the Bhagavad Gita. Arjuna is not given permission to act without thinking. He is called to understand his dharma, his responsibility in that situation, and to fulfill his duty with good judgment. The difference is between guiding your actions with a purpose and making your peace of mind depend on success. You can carefully prepare a presentation, hope that people respond well, and still recognize that you cannot fully control their reaction. Attachment begins when any response different from what you expected makes all your previous effort seem worthless. Krishna also warns against the opposite extreme, using detachment as an excuse not to act. In the same verse 2:47, he says not to become attached to inaction. This is important. Some people say they do not care about results when they are really avoiding the risk of trying. If they never begin, failure can never hurt their pride. The Gita rejects this kind of escape. Detachment is not indifference, laziness, or emotional numbness. It is the ability to give yourself fully to an action without demanding that reality sign a contract in advance guaranteeing victory, recognition, or security after every effort you make. This discipline is called karma yoga, the yoga of action. Instead of leaving the world behind, the person learns to act within it without becoming trapped by the results. The work continues, the decisions continue, and responsibility continues. What changes is the psychological center of the action. You stop asking only, "What will I get from this?" and begin asking, "What is the right thing for me to do now?" This change may seem small, but it can deeply transform the experience. When the result no longer owns your motivation, the effort itself can have value even before any outside reward appears. Think about someone who posts a creative project and spends the next several hours constantly checking the number of views. The work is finished, but the mind is still trying to control how people respond. Every increase brings excitement. Every quiet period feels like rejection. Little by little, creating stops being about skill, ideas, or the need to express something, and becomes a machine for getting validation. The teaching of the Gita would not tell you to completely ignore useful numbers or feedback, but it would warn you not to let them define the entire value of the act. Results can give information. Attachment can trap you by turning outside reactions into the final judge of your inner experience. Attachment also changes the way we deal with failure. When you believe that only winning makes the effort worthwhile, losing feels like proof that the whole attempt was useless. But an action can be right and still end badly because of unpredictable circumstances. In the same way, a careless decision can sometimes produce a good result by luck. If we judge everything only by the outcome, we confuse luck with wisdom and bad luck with failure. The Bhagavad Gita invites us to also consider intention, duty, awareness, and the quality of our effort. This allows us to learn from what happened without turning every bad result into a permanent judgment about who we are. There is also a deeper spiritual side to this teaching. Krishna explains that action performed without attachment can become a path to freedom, because it weakens the ego's obsession with my success, my victory, and my reward. The self stops acting as if it owns everything that happens. This does not remove individuality or responsibility. It reduces the expectation that all of reality should confirm our personal plans. The more the ego demands that the world approve every achievement, the more vulnerable it becomes when the world responds differently than expected. Detachment creates space to act without constantly demanding something in return from life. For this reason, the Gita does not offer a formula for guaranteeing success. It offers a different way to stay whole while you act. Do what needs to be done with attention, skill, and integrity. Plan, correct mistakes, learn, and keep going. Then recognize that the final result belongs to a larger network of causes that goes beyond your individual will. This understanding does not make life less meaningful or less intense. It removes an unnecessary weight from every decision. You no longer need to force the future to give you a guarantee before offering your best in the present. Action becomes clearer when it no longer carries the obligation to reward you. Zhuangzi begins with an unsettling insight. Often, we suffer less because of what happens and more because we insist that it should have happened differently. In his writings, he challenges the human tendency to freeze the world into rigid categories: right and wrong, gain and loss, success and failure, useful and useless. Reality, however, keeps moving before our ideas can fully capture it. When we demand that people, circumstances, and events follow our mental maps, we turn difference into resistance. The problem is not wanting change, but believing that reality made a mistake simply because it did not match what we expected from it. In the book Zhuangzi, one of the best-known stories tells of a man who dreams that he is a butterfly. When he wakes up, he wonders whether he was Zhuangzi dreaming that he was a butterfly, or a butterfly dreaming that it was Zhuangzi. The story is not meant to be just an intellectual puzzle. It is meant to shake our confidence that we see reality in a final and unquestionable way. What seems solid depends on perspective, time, and the distinctions we make. If our view is already limited, demanding that the world follow our interpretation exactly becomes a kind of arrogance disguised as certainty. This criticism also appears in the famous story of Cook Ding, who cuts up an ox with such skill that his movements seem like a dance. He explains that he stopped approaching the animal only with his eyes and learned to follow the natural spaces between its joints and structures. His knife lasts because he does not force it through places where there is no opening. Zhuangzi turns this scene into a philosophical image. Acting well does not mean forcing things to fit our will, but understanding their shape and moving through the openings they provide. Flexibility can accomplish what blind force only wears down, breaks, or makes unnecessarily difficult. The difference between acceptance and giving up is essential here. Acceptance does not mean approving injustice, abandoning your goals, or refusing to change situations that can be improved. It means first seeing what actually exists, without changing the facts in your mind, just to protect your expectations. If a relationship has ended, denying the ending will not restore it. If a plan has failed, insisting that failure should have been impossible will not change what happened. Only after clearly recognizing the situation can we respond to it. Zhuangzi would question a mind that spends all its energy arguing with reality before asking what can still be done within the situation. One of Zhuangzi's most famous challenges involves what we call useless. In several stories, crooked trees or wood that is worthless to carpenters survive, precisely because no one can turn them into useful products. What seems like a flaw from one point of view may become an advantage from another. This reversal shows how much we suffer when we demand that everything have a specific use, purpose, or destination. People can also carry this burden. They must produce, perform, and prove their value. Zhuangzi creates an opening in this way of thinking by asking whether everything in the world really needs to justify its existence according to our narrow standards of usefulness, efficiency, and social success. In another famous scene, Zhuangzi talks with Hizi about fish swimming in a river. Zhuangzi says they seem happy. Hizi replies that Zhuangzi is not a fish, so he cannot know that. A conversation plays with the limits of knowledge and perspective. We are always seeing things from a particular point of view, even though we often forget it. When we turn our own perspective into the absolute measure of reality, every difference looks like an error. Zhuangzi's wisdom begins when we recognize that our judgments are incomplete and that the world may contain meanings that do not immediately fit the categories we prefer to use. The spontaneity valued by Zhuangzi is not impulsiveness. It is closer to acting in such harmony with a situation that you no longer have to force every step. A skilled swimmer does not defeat the current by attacking it directly. He learns how the water moves and uses its movement to cross. This image offers an alternative to rigid control. Often, we want reality to stay still so our plans will work. Jiangxi suggests the opposite. Perhaps we need to develop the ability to change when circumstances change. Adapting does not mean losing your identity. It may be the very skill that allows you to remain whole without demanding that the world remain rigid. This attitude appears in a radical way in the story of the death of Zhuangzi's wife. When Hizi finds him, Zhuangzi is beating on a bowl and singing. He explains that at first he deeply felt the loss, but later reflected on the process of transformation in which life and death are part of the same natural movement. The story does not recommend being cold or emotionless in grief. It questions our demand that something that is born must remain forever in the form we love. Pain can exist without adding the accusation that change itself should never have happened to us. Zhuangzi also describes practices of mental emptying, such as the fasting of the mind, where a student is encouraged to let go of fixed assumptions and listen more openly. The goal is not to become empty of intelligence, but to become less trapped by automatic judgments. A mind filled with expectations interprets before it truly sees. It meets someone and immediately decides who that person should be. It faces a change and instantly calls it a disaster. To empty the mind means creating space for experience to appear before judgment takes over. In that space, new responses may become possible that a rigid mind would never have imagined. The key idea can be found in what Zhuangzi calls the hinge of the way, a position that is less trapped by rigid opposites and better able to respond to change without treating every surprise as an insult. This does not promise a life without loss, contradiction, or frustration. It offers something more realistic, the possibility of wasting less energy, demanding that reality apologize for being different from what we imagined. There are times to move forward, times to go around, and times to let go. Wisdom means recognizing which movement the moment allows without demanding that the entire river change direction, just to confirm the map we made before. Pascal observes that human beings have an extraordinary ability. They can escape from themselves without ever leaving where they are. In Pensées, he calls this escape divertissement, a French word often translated as distraction or diversion. He is not talking only about entertainment, but about any activity that keeps a person from sitting quietly with their own condition. Pascal believes we fear that encounter because it reveals weakness, mortality, dependence, and death. So we look for noise, tasks, aims, ambitions, and conversations to avoid the question that remains when everything becomes quiet. Who are we when nothing is distracting us? This idea comes from Pascal's deeply mixed view of human nature. He sees human beings as both great and miserable, capable of thought, science, love, and self-awareness, but also vulnerable to error, suffering, and death. In a famous passage from Pensées, he calls man a thinking reed. We are fragile like a plant that can easily be destroyed, but we know that we are fragile. That awareness sets us apart, but it also makes us uneasy. Distraction becomes a way to avoid constantly feeling the weight of this contradiction between our inner greatness and our physical weakness, which no achievement can completely remove. Imagine someone who finishes a full day of work and realizes they cannot spend even 5 minutes without looking for some kind of stimulation. They open one social media app, then another, watch videos, answer messages, check the news, and when they finally go to bed, they turn something on so they do not have to be alone with their own thoughts. Pascal would see something deeper here than a modern technology habit. The tools have changed, but the pattern is the same. We keep the mind occupied to avoid what appears when the activity stops. Silence becomes uncomfortable because it removes the layers that usually hide our deepest and hardest to name anxieties. In Pensées, Pascal suggests that even activities we consider serious can become distractions. A person may chase power, wealth, or recognition, not only because they value those things, but because the pursuit gives them constant movement. As long as they are running, they do not have to ask where they are going. That is why Pascal points to the strange nature of games and competition. Often, the prize matters less than the excitement created by the chase. If we simply gave the player what they wanted to win, they might still want the game, because the pursuit itself keeps their mind occupied and away from themselves for a while. This helps explain why reaching a goal does not always bring the peace we imagined. During the pursuit, the goal organizes our time, creates urgency, and gives the mind something clear to chase. After the achievement, an unexpected emptiness may appear, not because the victory was meaningless, but because it temporarily removes the structure that kept certain questions away. Who am I now? What do I do with my time? Why do I need to keep proving my worth? Pascal notices that we often quickly find a new goal, so we do not have to remain in that uncomfortable space where our inner restlessness becomes more visible and less hidden by constant outside tasks. There is an important difference between rest and divertisement. Rest can restore the body and mind. Distraction can be healthy, enjoyable, and necessary. Pascal is not condemning every form of entertainment. His criticism begins when distraction becomes an inability to be alone with yourself. At that point, entertainment stops being a choice and starts working like an anesthetic. You no longer look for entertainment because you simply want to enjoy something, but because you are afraid of what you may feel when it ends. The greater that fear becomes, the more activities you need to keep your mind constantly occupied and away from your own inner silence. Pascal also connects this escape to the desire for recognition. Being seen by other people can become a way of escaping uncertainty about who we are. If many people admire you, it may feel easier to believe that your life has unquestionable value. The problem is that outside approval must constantly be renewed. Public memory changes, status fades, and new people become the center of attention. So the search for visibility can become another form of distraction. We stay busy managing the image other people have of us, so we do not have to examine the relationship we have with ourselves when no one is watching. There is, however, an even deeper layer in Pascal's analysis. For him, distraction also hides the religious question. Human beings desire a kind of happiness that limited things cannot permanently provide. Pleasure, success, health, and companionship can all be valuable, but they remain vulnerable to change and death. The emptiness we feel cannot simply be solved with more stimulation because, in Pascal's view, it comes from the distance between our desire for complete fulfillment and the limits of human existence. Even people who do not share Pascal's Christian faith can still recognize the psychological power of this description of human dissatisfaction with things that always come to an end. Facing your own condition, then, does not mean deliberately making yourself sad. It means being willing to live with questions that do not offer an immediate reward. What in your daily routine is a real choice, and what is there only to prevent silence? Which ambitions come from deeply held beliefs, and which ones are simply ways of escaping? What feelings appear when nobody needs anything from you? These questions can be uncomfortable precisely because they remove the protection of constant activity. Pascal does not offer an easy psychology of comfort. He suspects that some discomfort is necessary if we want to discover what our endless busyness has been carefully hiding. Perhaps Pascal's most uncomfortable question is not how much time you waste on distractions, but what would happen if some of those distractions disappeared. Without notifications, goals, audiences, or noise, what kind of restlessness would begin to speak? The goal would not be to eliminate all entertainment, but to regain the freedom of not needing it all the time. A constantly busy life can look full from the outside while still being avoided from within. Pascal forces us to consider that maturity may include sitting with certain questions without immediately covering them with stimulation. After all, only when the noise becomes quieter can we discover what we were trying to avoid. Erich Fromm noticed a quiet change in the way many people build their identity. Instead of asking who they are becoming, they ask what they have managed to accumulate, in to have or to be. Published in 1976, he describes two basic ways of living, the having mode and the being mode. In the first, value means owning, controlling, and keeping. In the second, it means experiencing, participating, creating, and developing human abilities. Fromm is not simply criticizing material possessions. His criticism goes deeper. It begins when having things stops serving life and starts defining our entire sense of personal and social value. In the having mode, almost anything can be turned into a possession. You do not simply understand an idea. You have knowledge. You do not simply love someone. You begin to treat that person as mine. You do not simply live experiences. You collect places, titles, certificates, followers, and memories as proof that your life matters. Fromm sees this language as revealing because it shows how the logic of ownership enters areas that cannot truly grow under complete control. A human relationship, for example, loses its vitality when the other person is no longer treated as an individual, and instead becomes an extension of the identity of the person who wants to possess them in order to feel secure. The problem is that whatever you own has to be protected. The more your identity depends on possessions, status, and recognition, the greater your fear of losing them becomes. A house stops being just a place to live and starts proving success. A job title stops being a role and starts proving importance. Money stops being a resource and starts proving worth. When this happens, any outside threat can feel like a personal attack because losing something feels like losing part of yourself. Ownership promises security, but it often creates constant worry about everything that could be taken away tomorrow. Fromm also brings this criticism into the area of knowledge. In the having mode, learning means collecting information so you can repeat it, display it, or turn it into an advantage. A student listens to a class while thinking about what needs to be memorized, not about how the idea might change the way they understand the world. In the being mode, knowing is a living activity. A person connects ideas, questions assumptions, changes opinions, and allows knowledge to transform them. The difference is important. Someone can possess a huge amount of information and still remain intellectually stuck, unable to think independently about what they have learned throughout their life. Love may offer the most personal example. Fromm had already explored this idea in The Art of Loving, where he argued that loving is an activity, not simply something you possess. In the having mode, a person tries to have someone. They want exclusivity, guarantees, reassurance, and permanence. In the being mode, love involves care, responsibility, respect, and knowing the other person as a separate human being. This challenges a common illusion. The belief that getting into a relationship means you have solved the problem of love. For Frankl, relationships become weaker when they are treated as completed acquisitions instead of living practices that require presence, renewal, and freedom every day. Consumer society strengthens the having mode by suggesting that identity can be built through things you can buy. Clothes, devices, trips, brands, and experiences begin to communicate who you are, or who you want others to think you are. The problem is not using objects for comfort or self-expression, but depending on them to feel that your life has meaning. When every purchase temporarily gives you a more desirable version of yourself, the next purchase has to renew that feeling. Consumption then stops responding only to practical needs and begins feeding an identity that becomes outdated along with whatever you bought yesterday. Fromm also connects the having mode to the desire for authority. If ownership creates a sense of security, then controlling people, ideas, and institutions can seem like a natural extension of that logic. Instead of discussing an opinion, you try to defeat it or make it your own. Instead of building influence through trust, you seek obedience. The being mode, by contrast, is more comfortable with openness because it does not need to turn every difference into a threat to identity. Someone who is constantly focused on becoming can learn from what they do not control. Someone who needs to possess certainty tends to defend their beliefs like property that no one is allowed to touch. There is also an important difference in how we experience time. The having mode looks at the past as a collection and the future as a chance to acquire more. I did this. I achieved this. I will have this. The present can become nothing more than a bridge between what you already own and what you hope to gain later. The being mode requires presence because activities like talking, understanding, creating, observing, and loving only exist while they are happening. They cannot be stored perfectly on an inner shelf. You can remember a conversation, but you cannot possess its living energy after it ends. Some forms of richness disappear precisely because they were fully lived instead of turned into permanent possessions. Fromm's criticism does not ask you to give up everything you own or treat poverty as an automatic virtue. He makes it clear that human beings need decent material conditions in order to live well. His real question is about what stands at the center of life. If having is at the center, relationships become assets, ideas become products, and even the self becomes a project of accumulation. If being becomes more important, possessions can still be part of life, but they no longer decide its meaning by themselves. A person begins to measure wealth not only by what they own, but also by their ability to feel, think, create, share, and respond consciously to life. Maybe this is why the having mode creates a hunger that is so difficult to satisfy. Objects can be acquired, but no collection can permanently answer the question of who you are. When identity depends on acquiring things, every new possession has to confirm your existence all over again because the insecurity remains. Fromm suggests another direction. Move your attention from possession to living activity, from appearance to experience, and from control to relationship. Maybe the more useful question is not, what do I still need to have? But what human abilities are growing inside me? In that shift, value stops being an inventory and becomes experience again. Nietzsche begins by questioning something we usually treat as deeply personal, our desires. You say, I want this, as if that desire came naturally from some purely personal part of you. But for Nietzsche, much of what we call our own will may actually come from education, morality, tradition, fear, resentment, and the need for approval. You may chase a career, a certain kind of success, or a particular image of happiness without ever asking who placed that ideal in front of you. Nietzsche's suspicion begins right there. Before obeying a desire, maybe you need to investigate where it came from, how it developed, and who it really belongs to. And on the genealogy of morality, Nietzsche examines values that seem natural and shows that they have histories, conflicts, and interests behind them. The same method can be applied to desires. What feels like a personal choice may carry centuries of social expectations. You may want status because you learned that being admired means having value. You may want wealth not because you truly need it, but because poverty was taught to you as a sign of failure. You may want a certain lifestyle because society approves of it. Nietzsche would ask less, what do you want? And more, what forces taught you to want exactly this in this way at this point in your life? This investigation becomes even more intense when Nietzsche talks about herd morality. The herd does not simply mean other people. It describes a way of living where individuals accept ready-made values and repeat them without creating their own. The desire to belong is powerful. To avoid rejection, we often adjust our ambitions, tastes, opinions, and even our dreams to fit what seemed socially acceptable. A person feels like they made a free choice, even though they chose from a menu prepared by others. For Nietzsche, freedom requires more than choosing between available options. It requires the ability to question the values that make certain options attractive to us in the first place. This is where the idea of resentment becomes important. Nietzsche uses this term in a specific way to describe a reactive force that turns weakness into moral judgment. When someone cannot achieve something, they may begin to condemn what they secretly desire. Or, in the opposite direction, they may chase certain achievements only to prove that they are better than people who once hurt or rejected them. In that case, desire does not come from growth, but from reaction. Life becomes organized around answering someone, defeating someone, or proving someone wrong. Even victory can preserve dependence on that inner opponent who still determines the direction of your life. Throughout his work, Nietzsche often distinguishes between active and reactive forces. This helps explain why two desires that look the same from the outside can have completely different meanings. Two people may both want to write a book. One writes because they have something they genuinely need to create. The other writes because they want to humiliate someone who doubted them. The goal is the same, but the emotional source is different. Nietzsche forces us to look beneath the visible goal. A desire can look ambitious while still being deeply dependent because it continues to revolve around someone else's opinion that it wants to defeat, reject, or finally impress. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche presents the image of the three transformations of the spirit: the camel, the lion, and the child. The camel carries burdens and accepts commands. The lion learns to say no to the great dragon of "you must." The child represents creation, a new beginning, and a fresh yes to life. This sequence helps explain the problem of inherited desires. First, we carry the values we were given. Then, we need to question them. But saying no is not enough. If you only reject everything you were taught, you are still being defined by what you reject. A final step is creating values that can guide a life that is not simply a reaction to the past. This process of creating yourself should not be confused with shallow individualism or with doing whatever you feel like doing. Nietzsche does not worship every impulse simply because it seems to be yours. After all, impulses can also be shaped by habits, weakness, and circumstances. The work of becoming who you are requires discipline, interpretation, and transformation. In Ex Homo, the phrase "become who you are" points to a paradoxical process, not discovering a finished identity hidden inside you, but forming a unique way of living through the experiences, conflicts, choices, and creations that shape you throughout your life. The idea of the will to power also helps deepen this analysis. It should not be reduced to a desire to dominate other people. In Nietzsche, it can refer to growth, interpretation, creation, self-overcoming, and an increase in strength. A desire that expresses power in this sense tends to create form, style, and transformation. A purely reactive desire tends to seek compensation, revenge, or approval. The important question is not only whether you got what you wanted, but what kind of person you had to become in order to want it. Some goals expand your abilities. Others narrow your whole life until everything depends on a constant need for outside approval. Now think about the goals that seem almost required at certain stages of life. Getting a degree, becoming wealthy, getting married, buying a house, becoming visible, looking productive, traveling, or building a personal brand. None of these things are necessarily bad. The problem begins when you cannot explain why you want them without immediately repeating what everyone considers success. Nietzsche would ask an uncomfortable question. If no one could admire this achievement, would you still want it? If no one could envy you, would it still matter? If your answer changes completely, maybe the desire has more to do with an audience than with the life you actually want to create. The power of Nietzsche's challenge is that it removes the innocent appearance of desire. Wanting something does not prove that it is authentic. Feeling something strongly does not prove that it truly comes from you. Even a dream you have carried for years may be an emotional inheritance, a family expectation, or a reflection of shared social values. That is why knowing yourself also means learning to question what feels most personal. Some ambitions may deserve to be abandoned. Others may need to be rebuilt. Others may finally become yours once you understand them clearly. Nietzsche does not give you a list of correct desires. He gives you a harder task. Discover which desires increase your ability to create, act, and say yes to life without needing permission from the herd to exist. Confucius does not measure a good life by the shine of outside achievements, but by the quality of the character behind each choice. In the Analects, he presents the Junzi, often translated as the noble person or exemplary person, not as someone born into privilege, but as someone who develops morally. This change in focus is important. You can collect titles, money, influence, and recognition without developing kindness, a sense of justice, or self-control. For Confucius, success without inner growth can create a life that looks impressive on the outside, but remains disordered within, because social appearance can never replace real moral development. At the center of Confucian ethics is Ren, a term connected to humanity, kindness, or true human goodness. Ren is not just an abstract feeling of being a good person. It appears in the way we treat real people, especially those closest to us. Being truly human in this sense means learning to respond to others with respect, care, and responsibility. This requires daily practice, because character is not created by one heroic decision. It is built through small repeated actions, listening carefully, keeping your word, controlling impulses, admitting mistakes, and doing what is right even when no one is watching. Confucian greatness grows mainly through these quiet and consistent actions. Another important concept is Li, usually translated as ritual, proper behavior, or appropriate conduct. To a modern reader, ritual may sound like empty formality, but Confucius sees it as a way of training character. Gestures, manners, ceremonies, and habits shape emotions and relationships. By practicing respect, you do not only show respect, you also learn to feel it and make it part of who you are. Li gives structure to spontaneous behavior, so it does not turn into rudeness or selfishness. This goes against a culture obsessed with results, where efficiency is often valued more than courtesy. Confucius would remind us that how you achieve something matters just as much as what you achieve. This difference becomes clear when Confucius compares the Junzi with the Zhaoren, the small-minded person. The difference is not based on money or intelligence, but on character. The Junzi is guided by what is right. The Zhaoren is mainly guided by immediate personal benefit. In the Analects, we find the idea that the exemplary person understands what is right, while the small-minded person understands what is profitable. This does not mean that material gain is evil. It means asking what you are willing to sacrifice to get it. If an achievement requires betrayal, manipulation, or humiliation, its moral cost may be greater than its public value. Confucius first asks who you became while achieving it. This also creates a powerful criticism of social comparison. When you organize your life only around achievements, you constantly need to find someone below you to feel successful, or someone above you to decide what your next goal should be. Character works differently. You do not need to be more honest than someone else for honesty to have value. Kindness does not need to become a competition. Moral development changes the question from, how do I look compared to others, to how am I acting in this relationship? This shift reduces the power of outside rankings and brings attention back to what depends on your daily, conscious, and responsible actions. Confucius also gives great importance to learning. But for him, learning is not about collecting information as intellectual decoration. In the Analects, study is connected to reflection and practice. Knowing what is right without trying to live in the right way creates incomplete knowledge. That is why Confucian education is meant to change behavior, not simply improve or resume. A person may quote famous writers, have degrees, and speak intelligently while still being unable to listen, show gratitude, or admit they were wrong. For Confucius, knowledge that does not change behavior risks becoming decoration for the ego. Impressive on the outside, but useless in building real character. This development happens through relationships. Unlike philosophies that imagine virtue as something created in isolation, Confucius believes we become fully human through our connections with others. Family, friendship, community, and public life provide the situations where respect, loyalty, care, and responsibility are tested. This makes it impossible to completely separate character from relationships. You may think you are patient when you are alone, and discover your impatience when someone ruins your plans. You may believe you are generous until you actually have to share something valuable. Relationships reveal what speeches can hide. That is why building character means remaining willing to learn exactly where life with others exposes our weaknesses. The Confucian ideal also includes yi, often translated as righteousness or a sense of what is morally right. Yi prevents a person from turning every decision into a calculation of personal advantage. There are times when doing the right thing can cost opportunities, money, or approval. An ethical system focused only on results has difficulty understanding this sacrifice. Confucius insists that some actions have value because they express the right kind of character, even when they bring no immediate reward. This is why character cannot be measured only by what someone has achieved. Sometimes the most honorable decision is the one that prevents an unworthy victory from happening. This perspective deeply changes the meaning of ambition. Confucius does not ask people to live without goals, and he does not condemn public service, recognition, or professional success. He simply places these things below the development of the person. The question is no longer only, how far can I go? It must also include, what kind of person do I need to be while I move forward? That second question creates a moral limit. It prevents efficiency from being confused with human excellence. Someone can rise very high while carrying habits that make their presence harmful. For Confucius, a high position without virtue only increases the reach of flaws that were never corrected. That is why the Confucian challenge does not end when you receive a title, a promotion, or any public symbol of success. It continues when no one is applauding, and only the quality of your everyday actions remains. Do you treat people well when they have nothing to offer you? Do you keep your word when breaking it would be easier? Can you learn from criticism without treating correction as an insult? These questions reveal more about character than many trophies ever could. For Confucius, life is not a display case for showing victories, but a workshop where every action slowly shapes the person who will one day stand in the place you hope to reach. Aristotle makes a distinction that seems simple, but completely changes the way we think about satisfaction. Feeling pleasure is not the same as living well. In the Nicomachean Ethics, he asks what the highest good in human life is. His answer is eudaimonia, a term often translated as happiness or human flourishing. But this kind of happiness is not a temporary emotional state. It refers to an entire life shaped by choices, habits, and actions that help us fully develop what is best in human beings, especially our rational and moral abilities within community, relationships, and everyday decisions. For Aristotle, pleasure is not the enemy of a good life. In fact, he recognizes that certain virtuous activities are naturally pleasurable for someone who has developed good character. The problem begins when we make pleasure the highest standard for choosing what to do. If something feels good now, we assume it must be good. If something requires effort, we assume it should be avoided. But many pleasures can come with harmful actions, while valuable activities can involve discomfort. Learning, caring for someone, keeping a difficult promise, or standing up against injustice may not feel pleasant right away, but they can still be part of an excellent and meaningful life. This distinction becomes clearer when Aristotle asks what the human function is. A good knife cuts well. A good musician performs their art well. In the case of human beings, Aristotle argues that our excellence involves living and acting according to reason and virtue. Happiness, then, is not simply about receiving pleasant feelings. It is about using our abilities in an excellent way. You do not become happy the way you receive a prize placed in your hands. You become happy by living in a certain way, repeatedly choosing actions that shape your character and guide your desires throughout life. That is why habit has such an important place in Aristotle's ethics. We are not born fully courageous, moderate, or just. We become these things through practice. By acting justly, we develop a just character. By practicing moderation, we learn to desire things in the right measure. This means happiness depends not only on what we feel, but also on the kind of person we are becoming through our choices. Pleasure without character can follow any impulse. Virtue, on the other hand, trains our pleasures so that we begin to enjoy what is actually worth choosing. Character changes not only what we do, but also what we learn to enjoy doing. Moderation, or sophrosyne, makes this especially clear. Aristotle does not argue that physical pleasures should be eliminated, but that they should be enjoyed in the right amount. Eating can be pleasurable, but living only to eat reorganizes your life around one appetite. Rest is necessary, but constantly avoiding all effort weakens important abilities. Virtue looks for the appropriate middle ground between excess and deficiency, guided by reason. This middle is not simple mathematical balance or mediocrity. Courage, for example, stands between cowardice and recklessness. A virtuous person learns to feel, desire, and act with the right intensity, at the right time, and for the right reasons. The modern search for constant pleasure would seem strange to Aristotle, because no feeling stays the same all the time. Even a happy life includes exhaustion, grief, effort, frustration, and unpleasant responsibilities. If happiness meant feeling good every single moment, then any difficulty would prove that life had failed. Aristotle offers a stronger standard. Look at the overall shape of your life. A person can go through painful periods and still live with courage, friendship, and justice. In this sense, happiness has depth over time. It is not judged by a single moment, but by the consistency of a life lived with excellence across many years. Aristotle also recognizes that external goods matter. Health, friends, enough resources, and some stability all support a flourishing life. This prevents his philosophy from becoming the simple advice that thinking correctly is enough to be happy. Severe circumstances can deeply damage a person's life. Even so, external goods are not enough by themselves, because someone can have wealth, beauty, or influence and use those things in destructive ways. The important question is how these resources are used. Money can support generosity or feed greed. Power can serve justice or vanity. What matters is whether these things are guided by good character. Friendship has an especially important place in this view. In the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle devotes 2 books to friendship and says that no one would choose to live without friends, even if they had every other good thing. This reveals something important about happiness. It is not the private consumption of pleasant feelings. Flourishing includes relationships in which we can want what is good for another person, share activities, and recognize each other's virtues. Some friendships are based on usefulness, others on pleasure, but the highest kind of friendship develops between people who value each other's character. A life full of private pleasures can still remain deeply poor in human and moral terms. This philosophy also helps explain why directly chasing happiness can become confusing. If you constantly ask yourself, "Am I happy right now?" you begin judging your entire life by your current emotional state. Aristotle would shift your attention toward action. Am I living courageously, justly, wisely, and generously? These questions give us practical standards. Emotions change. Habits can be developed. Eudaimonia appears as the result of a certain way of living, not as a feeling we can simply command ourselves to experience. Just as physical health depends on many repeated habits, a good life depends on practices that shape our desires, choices, relationships, and responses to difficulty. Aristotle's challenge speaks directly to a culture that often confuses intensity with quality of life. Not everything exciting makes life better, and not everything difficult makes life worse. Some pleasures distract us, while some struggles help us grow. Aristotle would therefore ask you to judge an experience not only by how it made you feel, but also by what kind of activity and character it strengthened in you. After repeating a certain pleasure many times, have you become more free, more just, and more capable of making good choices, or simply more dependent on it? Happiness begins when pleasure stops ruling your life and instead becomes part of a virtuous way of living. For Viktor Frankl, happiness becomes harder to reach when it is turned into an obligation. In Man's Search for Meaning, he suggests that happiness and success should not be chased directly because they tend to appear as results of a life guided by meaning. When someone wakes up determined to be happy, they begin constantly checking their emotional state. Any sadness feels like failure, any anxiety feels like something is wrong, and any ordinary day feels like it is not enough. The search for happiness then begins to create pressure, self-monitoring, and frustration. Frankl changes the question. Instead of asking, "How can I feel happy?" ask, "What is life asking from me?" This reversal comes from logotherapy, the approach Frankl developed through his clinical work and his reflections on suffering, freedom, and responsibility. For him, human beings are not driven only by the search for pleasure, as Freud emphasized, or only by the search for power, which Frankl associated with Adler. There is also a will to meaning, the desire to feel that your life is connected to something worth committing to. That meaning does not have to be grand or dramatic. It can appear in work, love, a task, an ethical choice, or in the way you face a situation that cannot be changed. The problem with chasing happiness directly is similar to trying to force yourself to fall asleep. The more you tell yourself, "I need to sleep right now," the more aware you become that you are still awake. Frankl sees a similar process with happiness. When it becomes the main goal, your attention turns too much toward yourself. You measure your emotions, compare your days, look for signs of satisfaction, and try to force yourself to feel spontaneous. This intense self-monitoring can block the very thing you want. Joy often comes while we are involved in something beyond ourselves, not while we question every moment to see whether we are finally happy enough. Man's Search for Meaning also made Frankl widely known for his account of the Nazi concentration camps. He does not romanticize suffering or claim that every kind of pain automatically has meaning. His position is more careful. When an unavoidable situation cannot be changed, there is still the possibility of choosing the attitude with which we face it. This does not make suffering desirable. It makes the human response morally meaningful. Meaning can appear in the way someone preserves dignity, responsibility, or love, even under extreme conditions. Happiness in that situation may appear as a possible result, but it is never a guaranteed reward for silently enduring suffering. Frankl emphasizes self-transcendence, a central idea in his view of human beings. We fulfill ourselves more deeply when we move beyond constant self-focus and direct ourselves toward a cause, a person, or a responsibility larger than our own ego. This helps explain why someone can feel deeply alive during a difficult task, even without feeling constant pleasure. A doctor during an emergency, a parent caring for a child, or an artist focused on a project may temporarily forget to measure their own happiness. They are involved in something that requires their full attention and real commitment in that moment. This also changes the way we understand work. A job does not have to be a perfect calling in order to have meaning, but it can become empty when its only purpose is to produce status, money, or validation. Frankl would ask what real responsibility that work allows you to take on, who benefits from it, and what human abilities you use through it. Meaning is not the same as constant excitement. Sometimes it requires discipline, patience, and effort without an immediate emotional reward. That is exactly why it can support a person during periods when pleasure, motivation, and recognition decrease. Meaning gives direction when emotion alone does not provide enough energy. Love has an equally important place in Frankl's thought. Loving someone does not simply mean experiencing a pleasant emotion, but recognizing that person's uniqueness and helping them see possibilities they may not yet be able to see in themselves. In that relationship, happiness is not demanded as a product that the other person must constantly provide. It can appear as a result of care, presence, and commitment. This is very different from expecting another person to constantly fill our emptiness, entertain us, and confirm our worth. When someone is given that impossible responsibility, love can turn into constant pressure and emotional dependence. Frankl also speaks about the existential vacuum, a feeling of having no clear direction that can appear even when material needs are already met. A person may have comfort, choices, and entertainment, but still not know what they are living for. In that situation, chasing happiness can become a form of compensation. More experiences, more consumption, more stimulation, more travel, more validation. None of these things are necessarily bad, but they may become attempts to fill an emptiness that exists at a different level. For Frankl, meaning cannot simply be bought or created through greater intensity. It appears when we recognize a task, a relationship, or an attitude that deserves our commitment despite our present circumstances. There is a statement associated with Frankl that summarizes this idea. Success, like happiness, cannot be pursued directly. It must happen as a result. The point is not to reject goals, results, or positive emotions. It is to reorganize priorities. When you choose an action only because you expect it to make you happy, every delay can feel like wasted time. When you choose it because you see meaning in it, you can continue even during emotionally difficult days. This makes life less dependent on excitement. You can be tired and still committed, sad and still loving, uncertain and still responsible. Meaning provides continuity where moods naturally rise and fall. Frankl's final challenge changes the way you might judge a day. Maybe a day does not need to feel happy in order to have been valuable. It may have included an important conversation, a responsibility fulfilled, a courageous decision, or your presence given to someone who needed it. When happiness stops being a goal that you monitor every minute, space opens for something more stable, living in a way that responds to real responsibilities. Frankl does not promise that meaning will remove pain. He shows that life can remain meaningful, even when it cannot be pleasant all the time. For the Dalai Lama, happiness built only on favorable circumstances has an unavoidable weakness. It lasts only as long as those conditions last. If your peace depends on praise, comfort, money, health, recognition, or the absence of problems, any outside change can directly shake your inner state. This does not mean circumstances do not matter. Some clearly make life safer or more difficult. The point is that none of them remain completely under our control. That is why Tibetan Buddhist tradition places so much importance on training the mind as a way to develop a kind of stability that does not disappear every time the world changes in an unpredictable way. In The Art of Happiness, a book based on conversations with Howard Cutler, the Dalai Lama repeatedly explains that happiness should not be confused with temporary pleasure. Pleasure often depends on specific experiences and can disappear as soon as they end. A deeper kind of happiness is connected to a trained state of mind that can respond to life with greater balance. This changes the question from what needs to happen for me to feel okay, to how am I training my mind to deal with what happens? The first question gives power to circumstances. The second brings attention back to how we relate to them. This difference becomes clear when something goes wrong. Imagine receiving unexpected criticism at work. If your self-worth and peace of mind depend completely on outside approval, a single comment can control your entire day. Your mind repeats the criticism, imagines hidden intentions, and turns discomfort into a threat to your identity. The Dalai Lama would suggest observing what happened before adding more interpretations to it. Maybe the criticism contains something useful. Maybe it is unfair. In either case, your response can be trained. The situation arrived without your permission, but you still have some choice in how you receive it, examine it, and respond. This kind of training is not simply positive thinking. The tradition represented by the Dalai Lama recognizes suffering, injustice, illness, and loss as real parts of life. The goal is to avoid adding a second layer of suffering through endless worrying, hostility, and mental resistance. When something unpleasant happens, we often ask why it happened to us and imagine that life should have followed a different path. That reaction can make the original pain even stronger. Developing stability means allowing the mind to recognize pain without immediately turning it into your identity, your destiny, or proof that everything is wrong. The suffering is taken seriously, but it does not have to take over everything. Compassion plays a central role because it breaks the constant focus on our own discomfort. When all our attention revolves around my problems, my losses, and my expectations, every difficulty becomes larger inside a very narrow point of view. The Dalai Lama often connects happiness with genuine concern for the well-being of others. This does not mean ignoring your own needs. It means widening your perspective. When you recognize that other people also face fear, illness, loneliness, and uncertainty, you stop seeing every difficulty as something uniquely unbearable. Compassion does not remove the problem, but it can reduce the psychological isolation that often makes the problem feel heavier. Another important idea is the difference between physical pleasure and mental peace. A comfortable environment can help you rest, but it cannot prevent anxious thoughts. A great meal can feel good for a few hours, but it cannot solve inner conflict. The Dalai Lama does not reject these pleasures. He simply rejects the idea that they can create lasting happiness by themselves. If the mind remains restless, changing outside conditions will only create temporary relief. That is why practices such as meditation, reflection, and compassion are so important. They aim to transform the mind that experiences circumstances instead of constantly trying to rearrange everything outside it. This stability also depends on understanding that emotions can be trained. In the Buddhist thought presented by the Dalai Lama, anger, jealousy, and anxiety do not have to be treated like commands that must be followed. They arise from causes and conditions, and they can be examined. If someone succeeds and you feel jealous, for example, the first reaction may appear automatically. But you can feed that jealousy by constantly comparing yourself and imagining unfairness, or you can examine what the feeling is telling you. The practice is to recognize the emotion without giving it complete control over your behavior. Inner freedom begins when feeling something no longer means you have to obey it. There is also an important change in the way we relate to success and failure. When happiness depends on success, life becomes divided between moments when you feel that your value has been confirmed and moments when you believe you have lost it. This makes every result emotionally huge. The Dalai Lama suggests a more stable foundation. Inner qualities such as patience, kindness, discipline, and clarity can continue to grow during both good and difficult periods. Failure may limit certain outside opportunities, but it does not have to prevent personal or moral growth. In the same way, success can create new opportunities without becoming final proof that you are superior or permanently more valuable than others. This also helps explain why gratitude is not only possible when everything is perfect. We can notice something good even during a difficult day. A trained mind sees details that the search for perfect conditions often misses. You may have financial worries and still have friendship. You may be dealing with illness and still receive care. A project may have failed while another possibility is beginning to appear. Gratitude does not erase suffering. It prevents one difficulty from taking over your entire awareness. The ability to hold different realities at the same time creates a kind of happiness that depends less on the fantasy that everything must be solved before we can truly live. The Dalai Lama's message, then, is not about building an emotional wall that makes you unaffected by the world. It is about developing a mind wide and stable enough not to be carried away by every change. Circumstances will continue to bring gains and losses, meetings and goodbyes, praise and criticism. Some moments will deserve celebration. Others will require courage. What changes is the belief that happiness can exist only when everything goes according to our wishes. A deeper stability comes from the daily practice of attention, compassion, and perspective. The world can remain uncertain without every uncertainty having the power to decide the entire quality of your inner life. Thich Nhat Hanh points to a habit so common that we barely notice it, living as if real life has not started yet. You finish one task while thinking about the next, work while waiting for vacation, go through the week waiting for the weekend, and endure the present for the sake of an imagined future. The problem is that when that future finally arrives, the mind has already found another point farther ahead. In The Miracle of Mindfulness, Thich Nhat Hanh suggests a radical change. Life is not waiting for you after the next achievement. It is happening right now, in the very moment you often treat as nothing more than a transition. This does not mean giving up goals or refusing to prepare for tomorrow. The Vietnamese Zen master does not place presence against responsibility. Planting today so you can harvest tomorrow is part of life. The problem begins when the future receives all the value and the present becomes only a tool. You accept months of exhaustion because you imagine you will rest later. Neglect people close to you because you believe you will have more time in the future, and postpone peace until certain conditions are finally met. In this way, you build a happiness that is always conditional. It can begin someday, but never now. The calendar moves forward while the present keeps being sacrificed. For Thich Nhat Hanh, mindful breathing is a simple way to interrupt this escape. Breathing in while knowing that you are breathing in, and breathing out while knowing that you are breathing out, may sound almost too simple. That is exactly why it reveals something important. The mind is used to valuing only what produces visible results. Breathing does not build a resume, make money, or bring recognition. Yet when you truly follow a breath, you return to your body and to the present moment. In Peace is Every Step, he presents practices like this to show that attention does not depend on special occasions. Everyday life can become a place of full presence again. One of his best-known phrases is, "I have arrived. I am home." The phrase expresses a break from the feeling that we constantly need to reach another place before we can rest inside ourselves. Being home does not mean giving up the journey. It means no longer walking like someone permanently separated from the present. You can be on your way to a meeting and still feel your steps. You can work on a project and still notice the person beside you. You can want to improve your life without turning every day into a payment for some future happiness. The destination no longer has to completely take over the journey you are living now. This becomes especially clear in the way we do ordinary tasks. Thich Nhat Hanh says that washing the dishes should simply be washing the dishes. If you wash them only to finish quickly so you can drink tea afterward, you treat that part of your life as disposable time. Then, when you finally sit down with the tea, your mind may already be thinking about something else. Mindfulness interrupts this chain. Feeling the water, noticing your movements, and being fully present in that simple action does not turn washing dishes into something extraordinary. It turns you into someone who does not need to escape ordinary moments in order to recognize that you are alive. The race toward the future is often driven by a promise. Once certain things are taken care of, we will finally be able to relax. But life rarely gives us that perfectly organized point. One problem ends and another appears. One goal is completed and another takes its place. If peace depends on having absolutely nothing left to deal with, it will always be delayed. Thich Nhat Hanh teaches that conditions for happiness can exist alongside difficulties. You may have a problem and still notice the sky, your breathing, a friendship, or a meal. Presence does not require perfection. It requires the ability not to let what is unfinished erase everything else that is also here. This practice even changes the way we relate to other people. Often, we are physically with someone while mentally somewhere else. Our body is part of the conversation, while our mind is reviewing responsibilities, messages, and future problems. Thich Nhat Hanh sees presence as one of the deepest ways of showing love. To say, in essence, "I am here for you," means offering real attention. It does not help to promise that you will care better for someone someday if you are never fully there when that person is right in front of you. Relationships do not happen in some planned future. They happen in the actual minutes when we choose to listen, look, and stay present. There is also a healing side to this philosophy. When we constantly escape into tomorrow, difficult emotions can remain unnoticed. Planning can become a way of avoiding sadness, fear, or loneliness. Mindfulness moves in the opposite direction. It recognizes what is present without immediately trying to push it away. Thich Nhat Hanh often uses the image of holding suffering the way a mother holds a crying child. This does not mean feeding the pain. It means approaching it with care. When we can stay with an emotion, it no longer has to scream as loudly to be noticed, and the need to escape begins to lose some of its psychological power. Another important teaching is interbeing. The present is not an isolated point between the past and the future. It contains the effects of the past and the seeds of what will come. When you drink a cup of tea, there is rain, soil, human work, and time within that experience. This understanding makes the present deeper rather than smaller. Being present does not mean living without memory or planning. It means noticing how much is contained in a single moment. When you truly meet the present, you also notice relationships and conditions that normally go unseen. The future then stops being the only place where meaning, gratitude, and fulfillment can exist. Thich Nhat Hanh does not ask you to destroy your goals. He asks you to notice the price you pay when you turn the present into fuel for reaching them. Some projects deserve effort, waiting, and discipline. But no future achievement can fully give back years that were lived without attention. The time saved so you can live later is not stored somewhere waiting for you. Every day used only as preparation was already part of your life. Maybe the hardest practice is learning to walk toward tomorrow without abandoning the ground beneath your feet. Because someone who learns to arrive with every step no longer has to wait for the destination to start living. Imagine spending years climbing a mountain because you believe real life will begin once you reach the top. Dogen would question that very idea. For him, the path is not something less important that only prepares you for a future achievement. The practice itself already expresses what you are looking for. In Zen, this appears in the idea that practice and realization are one. Sitting in Zazen should not be treated as a tool you use now in order to reach enlightenment later. When we turn the path into nothing more than a means to an end, we begin to overlook every real step in favor of an imagined destination that never seems close enough. Dogen develops this view in writings collected in the Shobo Genzo and also in the Fukan Zizenji, a text focused on Zazen practice. Instead of presenting meditation as a ladder toward some special state, he insists that practice and awakening should not be separated. This deeply changes the usual way we think about spiritual growth. Normally we think, first I am incomplete, then I practice, and finally I reach a higher state. Dogen breaks apart this sequence. If you practice only to become someone different in the future, you risk turning even spirituality into another form of impatience, comparison, and dissatisfaction with the life you are already living right now. This unity is often called practice realization, an important idea for understanding Dogen. The phrase suggests that realization is not a reward added to practice after enough effort. Realization is expressed in the act of practicing itself. This does not mean that learning, growth, or deeper understanding do not exist. It simply means that each moment of practice already has value and does not need the future to justify it. A musician does not play only to finish the song. The music exists while it is being played. In the same way, life does not happen only when your goals are completed. It is happening during the everyday process of living. This perspective speaks directly to the anxiety of people who are always waiting to arrive. Arrive at the perfect job, the right relationship, financial stability, the body they want, or emotional maturity. Each goal seems like a line that once crossed will finally put life in order. But this expectation itself creates distance between you and your life. The present becomes a waiting room. Dogen might ask what exactly you expect to find later that cannot already be practiced now. Patience, attention, discipline, and presence are not rewards handed to you at the end. They are real ways of walking the path while it is still unfolding. In the Genjo Kwan, one of his best-known writings, Dogen says that to study the Buddha way is to study the self, and to study the self is to forget the self. This points to an important change. While we are focused on arriving somewhere, we are often busy building a future image of ourselves. We want to become wiser, more admired, calmer, more fulfilled. Deep practice interrupts this constant creation of the person we think we should become. Forgetting the self does not mean erasing your personality. It means reducing the obsession with constantly measuring every experience according to the progress of the ego and the person it imagines it must become. This helps explain why Dogen values shikantaza, usually translated as just sitting. The practitioner sits without turning meditation into a deal. I do this now so I can receive peace later. Posture, breathing, and attention do not need to produce a spiritual trophy. This lack of a practical goal can feel strange because we are used to asking what benefit every activity will give us. Dogen changes the question. Some actions have value simply because they are fully lived. Eating, walking, working, and sitting can stop being passages toward something else and become complete expressions of life when they receive our full attention in the present moment. This view also changes our relationship with time. In Dogen's thought, especially in the section called Yuji, or being time, existence and time are not completely separate things. We are not simply individuals moving through a container called time. Our existence happens through time, moment by moment. That is why waiting for life to begin in the future contains a contradiction. The future can only appear as a present moment when it finally arrives. If you never learn to live in this moment, you will carry the same habit of postponing life into the next one. The date changes, the goal changes, but the habit of never arriving remains. The image of the moon reflected in water, found in the Zhenju Quan, helps deepen this idea. Dogen describes the entire moon being reflected even in a tiny drop of water. Something limited does not need to become unlimited in order to fully take part in reality. A moment does not need to last forever in order to be complete. This challenges our habit of judging moments only by what they will produce later. A conversation can matter even if it brings no advantage. A period of study can be meaningful before the diploma arrives. An act of care can be complete even without recognition. When everything has to justify itself through a future result, we lose the unique richness of what is happening now. Dogen also does not use this view as an excuse for laziness or doing nothing. Zen monasteries required strict discipline, schedules, work, study, and attention to even the smallest details. A point is not to give up effort, but to give up the idea that effort only becomes meaningful when it is finished. Preparing a meal, cleaning a room, or sitting in meditation can be complete practices when they are done without dividing the mind between an insufficient now and a perfect later. That division creates a strange life. We do everything while thinking about what comes next, and when the next thing finally arrives, we immediately turn it into another step toward something else. Perhaps Dogen's hardest teaching is accepting that there is no magical point where you will stop practicing life because you have finally mastered it. No achievement removes the need for attention, choice, and presence. Even after reaching a goal, there will still be mornings, a body, relationships, work, and change, asking for your response again. Maturity does not mean reaching a platform above the path. It means realizing that the path and the destination were never completely separate. When this becomes clear, every action stops being just an investment in some ideal future. You do not need to finish your life before you can recognize that you have already arrived. In Zen, there is a strange paradox. The more desperately you try to reach a perfect state, the more you confirm the idea that something is wrong with you right now. The search itself can create the distance it is trying to remove. If you believe that peace, awakening, or fulfillment are always somewhere ahead, then every present moment becomes proof that you are not there yet. The mind begins comparing what is with what it thinks should be, and tension grows from that comparison. Zen does not reject practice, discipline, or study. It questions the attitude of turning the spiritual path into another race to fix a self that is seen as incomplete. This criticism appears in many Zen teachings that refuse to completely separate practice from realization. A student arrives at a monastery expecting to receive something special, a mind without thoughts, unshakable peace, or an identity that finally feels complete. Then they begin judging every meditation by its result. If they feel calm, they think they are making progress. If they feel restless, they think they have failed. The problem is that meditation becomes a tool for getting something. Instead of observing experience, the person tries to create a specific experience. In that way, the desire for awakening begins working just like any other desire that promises future satisfaction while keeping the feeling of lack alive. Shunryu Suzuki, a 20th century Zen teacher, made the phrase beginner's mind widely known in the West. In Zen mind, beginner's mind, he says that in the beginner's mind there are many possibilities, while in the expert's mind there are few. The idea is not about praising ignorance, but openness. When you think you already know exactly what you should feel, understand, or achieve, you begin filtering experience through rigid expectations. The beginner does not practice without effort. The beginner is simply less trapped by an image of the result. This makes it possible to practice without demanding that every session prove that progress is happening. The Zen koan also works against the tendency to turn understanding into something we can own. Questions such as, "What is the sound of one hand?" do not work like normal riddles with a hidden answer waiting to be discovered through logic. They can interrupt habits of thought that try to turn everything into a concept that can be controlled. The mind wants to reach a solution, classify it, and say, "Now I understand." The koan frustrates that hunger for a final answer. It forces the practitioner to notice the limits of a mind that wants to control experience through explanation. Sometimes, searching for the correct answer is exactly what prevents direct contact with the question itself. This same logic appears in the teaching of non-duality. The mind usually divides reality into two sides: me here, enlightenment there; me incomplete, fulfillment far away; practice now, realization later. Zen questions whether this separation is as solid as it seems. As long as you imagine enlightenment as an object that a separate you must achieve, you strengthen the very sense of separation you are trying to overcome. It is like looking for glasses that are already on your face. A search continues because it begins with an assumption that was never examined. Something essential is missing, and one day it will finally be added to you when you reach the right state. There is an important danger here: misunderstanding Zen as saying that nothing needs to be done. If there is nowhere to arrive, why meditate, study, or develop awareness? Zen tradition answers through practice itself. Not chasing a future reward does not mean giving yourself completely to old habits. Sitting, breathing, working, and observing the mind still require discipline. What changes is your relationship with those actions. You do not practice in order to manufacture an ideal version of yourself. You practice to see more clearly what is happening. Practice stops being an investment in a future identity and becomes a direct investigation of experience. This change also transforms the way we relate to unpleasant emotions. If practice is supposed to produce permanent peace, then anger and anxiety look like obstacles that prove you are doing something wrong. The practitioner begins fighting every difficult emotion in order to protect the image of calm they hope to achieve. In Zen, however, observing anger can be just as much a part of practice as experiencing peace. The goal is not to turn every moment into a pleasant feeling, but to clearly see what appears, without immediately holding on to it or pushing it away. When discomfort stops being proof of failure, the mind no longer needs to create a different experience just to justify the path. The teacher Linji, known in Japan as Rinzai, warned students against searching for the Buddha outside themselves or chasing special states. His language could be harsh because he wanted to break their dependence on authorities, concepts, and idealized images of awakening. When a practitioner turns enlightenment into something extraordinary, ordinary life begins to seem unimportant. Eating feels ordinary. Walking feels ordinary. Talking feels ordinary. Everything has to point toward some higher moment. Zen responds by giving importance back to ordinary life, not because everyday life is magically perfect, but because no life can be found outside the real activities that make up our days. There is also a criticism of becoming attached to a spiritual identity. A person may begin by searching for freedom and end up becoming proud of being detached, aware, or evolved. At that point, the ego simply returns wearing spiritual clothes. Zen includes many stories that make fun of proud or self-important teachers, because any Realization turned into a title can become another object of attachment. The search for an ego-free state can strengthen an identity based on appearing to have no ego. This paradox helps explain why Zen values simplicity and humor. Sometimes taking your own spiritual search too seriously is another way of remaining trapped by it without realizing it. Maybe the Zen question is not, when will I finally reach what I am looking for? But what does my search say about this moment? If every search begins by declaring that right now is not enough, you can spend decades strengthening the exact feeling of lack you are trying to overcome. This does not mean giving up your goals. It means noticing when a goal turns into constant rejection of what is already here. Zen invites you to sit before running, observe before correcting, and experience before naming. In that moment, the feeling of lack stops quietly controlling the search. You can keep walking without inventing a future arrival in order to give value to the path you are already on. Ramana Maharshi takes the question of satisfaction to a much deeper level. Before trying to become satisfied, investigate who is actually doing the wanting. When you ask what is missing, you are already assuming that there is a stable, separate, needy self that must receive something from the outside. For him, that assumption deserves to be examined, because the seeker may be an essential part of the very problem it is trying to solve. His famous question, "Who am I?" is not asking for a psychological description, a profession, a personal history, a personality, a belief, a memory, or a social identity. It points toward the awareness that claims all of these things and constantly says, "I want, I fear, I need." The method became known as self-inquiry, or Atma Vikara, and became central to Ramana Maharshi's teaching. When a thought appears, he recommends asking who that thought appears to, directing attention back toward its source. The natural answer is usually, "It appears to me." Then the inquiry continues by asking who this me is. The goal is not to produce a clever verbal answer, but to turn attention toward the subject that seems to be thinking everything. In this way, the question works less like an intellectual puzzle and more like a tool for interrupting automatic identifications that normally go unnoticed. Usually when you say you are dissatisfied, you immediately look for something that can change that feeling and restore your inner balance. That something may be money, recognition, a relationship, knowledge, a spiritual experience, or simply an ideal version of yourself in the future. Ramana questions the movement that comes before the choice, asking why your sense of identity seems to depend on what appears outside you. If each achievement temporarily strengthens the desiring self, another sense of lack can soon appear and start the search all over again. So perhaps the deeper issue is not satisfying one desire after another, but understanding the structure of the one who constantly declares itself incomplete. In Ramana's teachings, the basic sense of I appears as the root of our identification with the body, thoughts, roles, and experiences. This psychological self creates stories. I succeeded, I lost, I deserve this, I failed, I still need to become something different. Each story adds more content to identity, but rarely investigates the awareness in which all these statements constantly appear and disappear. That is why collecting inner experiences can become similar to collecting material objects if both are used only to strengthen an imagined character. Self-inquiry tries to discover whether this character is really the permanent center we assume exists behind experience. It is important not to confuse this question with rejecting personality or denying the real needs of the body and everyday life. Ramana ate, talked, answered questions, and took part in the daily life of the ashram. His inquiry did not require pretending that ordinary experiences did not exist. The question is different. Does what happens completely define who you are, or does it appear within an awareness that comes before personal descriptions? This distinction prevents self-knowledge from being reduced to collecting information about your preferences, traumas, talents, opinions, and personal history. Understanding mental content can be valuable, but Ramana directs the inquiry toward that which is aware of any content appearing in experience. This approach also changes your relationship with emotions, because it asks who is claiming to have fear, anxiety, jealousy, pride, or frustration right now. Instead of immediately reacting to the emotion, attention steps back and observes the identification forming around it. You temporarily stop saying only, "I am anxious," and begin asking who this I is that is claiming the anxiety. This shift does not magically remove the feeling, but it can weaken the connection between a temporary experience and your entire identity. When that connection becomes weaker, there is more room to see that mental states can happen without becoming the complete definition of who you are. Ramana connects this inquiry with silence, not simply as the absence of words, but as the recognition of an awareness that exists before thought. Thoughts can describe the self forever, but every description becomes another object noticed within experience. If you can observe an idea about yourself, Ramana asks, can that idea really be the observer that is present? The inquiry keeps removing identifications, not to reach an empty intellectual state, but to discover what remains when concepts become quiet. That is why memorized answers have limited value. Saying, "I am awareness," is not the same as directly recognizing what those words are pointing toward. This perspective also directly challenges spiritual consumerism, where we search for techniques, teachers, retreats, and experiences as pieces that can complete our identity. Ramana does not have to condemn these practices to show that any spiritual path can be taken over by the same ego that wants to make itself more important. You can give up material possessions and begin collecting mystical experiences, spiritual recognition, or the image of being an enlightened person. The outside form changes, but the basic structure remains the same. Someone is still trying to become complete by acquiring something. Self-inquiry interrupts this constant change of objects and keeps returning to the one who says it needs completeness before it can finally rest. One consequence of this view is that satisfaction no longer depends on solving every desire that appears on the surface of the mind. This does not mean becoming indifferent to hunger, injustice, or responsibility, or confusing spiritual understanding with neglecting the world. It means recognizing that fixing outside circumstances will not necessarily answer the question of the identity that continues demanding absolute security. If that identity remains unquestioned, every solution may simply move the feeling of lack toward another object soon afterward. Investigating the self means questioning the very foundation that turns changing experiences into constant proof of personal completeness or personal deficiency. There is something very different about asking who is doing the wanting, because attention moves away from the desired object and returns to the one who named it. This movement does not offer another achievement, another philosophy to show off, or a new identity that can impress people watching you. It questions the imagined owner of the achievements, losses, memories, and expectations that organize the story we tell about ourselves. Perhaps that is why Ramana's question cannot be finished with a sentence memorized from a spiritual book. When the self that demands satisfaction is investigated all the way to its root, the search itself is no longer the same search it was before. Thank you for staying with me until the end. If any of these ideas made you look at your own desires in a different way, tell me in the comments. Which of these philosophies affected you the most? Like the video to help this content reach more people. Share it with someone who also feels like nothing is ever enough. And subscribe to the channel so we can keep exploring the big questions of philosophy together. And don't leave just yet. Stay here and choose one of the next videos on the channel. Maybe the next reflection is exactly what you needed to find.